Please, just give him this letter, okay? Lara whispered, pressing the pale blue envelope into my hands with such hopeful eyes that saying no felt impossible. The most popular guy on campus smiled at me, and somehow became convinced the letter was mine. If I had known one harmless favor could quietly turn my entire college life upside down, I would have walked the long way across campus and pretended I never saw Lara that morning. My name is Ethan Brooks, and if there is one thing everyone should know about me, it's that I have an impossible habit of helping people before thinking through the consequences. Lara Bennett had biology with me every Tuesday and Thursday. She was kind, funny, and completely incapable of talking to Mason Carter without forgetting how to breathe. Everyone knew Mason. He wasn't just captain of the basketball team. He had perfect grades, volunteered at the local children's hospital every other weekend, and somehow still managed to remember professors' names. Students called him the Golden Boy because everything around him seemed to glow just a little brighter. I honestly never expected someone like him to even recognize me. I was simply the guy who always had extra pens, shared class notes, and accidentally became everyone's backup partner whenever group projects fell apart. That morning, the fall air carried just enough chill to make everyone wrap hoodies tighter as students rushed between brick buildings with steaming coffee cups. Lara stopped me outside the library, clutching the envelope with both hands. Please, I can't do it myself. I laughed. You're making this sound like a hostage negotiation. She rolled her eyes before gently pushing the envelope into my backpack. Just hand it to him before economics. Easy enough. Or so I thought. I spotted Mason near the fountain outside the business building. He stood alone, sunlight catching the edges of his light brown hair while students casually waved as they passed. He answered every greeting with the same polite smile, but somehow he still looked distant, like someone attending a party he never wanted to join. I walked over, pulled the envelope from my backpack, and called his name. He turned immediately. Hey, he said warmly, as if we'd been friends for years instead of strangers who had probably shared the same hallway 100 times. This is for. Before I could finish, a gust of wind slipped between us. The envelope slipped from my fingers and landed at Mason's feet. He bent down, picked it up, and before I could explain, his eyes caught the first sentence visible through the slightly opened flap. I like you more than I know how to say. His expression changed so subtly most people would have missed it. His smile softened. His shoulders relaxed. For just one quiet second, he looked genuinely surprised. Then he looked directly at me. Thank you, he said quietly. My mouth opened. Actually, it's not. I've never had anyone tell me like this before. Every word I wanted to say tangled together. At that exact moment, the warning bell echoed across campus. Students flooded around us, and someone shouted Mason's name from the basketball court. He carefully folded the envelope against his chest before smiling again. Can we talk after class? I watched him disappear into the crowd before my brain finally started working again. My phone buzzed. It was Lara. Did you give him the letter? I stared at the message while another notification appeared from the college gossip account. Breaking. Did Ethan Brooks just confess to Mason Carter outside the library? There was already a blurry photo attached. I felt every ounce of color drain from my face. Somewhere behind me, 2 freshmen whispered my name. I turned around, ready to explain the truth for the first time. Then I saw Mason glance back from across the courtyard. He smiled at me again, and for reasons I couldn't possibly explain. I couldn't make myself ruin that smile. By lunchtime, the entire campus had somehow reached the same impossible conclusion. Nobody asked me what had actually happened. Nobody asked Lara. They simply accepted the story that Ethan Brooks had confessed his feelings to Mason Carter in front of the library. I learned very quickly that college rumors traveled faster than any professor could finish taking attendance. My phone buzzed every few minutes with messages from classmates I barely knew. Some congratulated me. Others demanded details. A few wanted to know whether Mason had said yes. I stared at the screen in disbelief before shoving the phone deep into my backpack. Maybe if I ignored everything long enough, reality would eventually catch up with the truth. Unfortunately, reality seemed to be running several miles behind gossip. When I arrived at my economics lecture, nearly every seat was already filled. The room usually buzzed with quiet conversations before class began, but today dozens of eyes followed me as I walked toward the middle row. Someone whispered my name. Someone else laughed softly. I heard another student say, "That is him." I wanted to disappear beneath the floor. Instead, I kept walking until I reached my seat, pretending none of it bothered me. A moment later, the empty chair beside me slid backward. I looked up and nearly forgot how breathing worked. Mason Carter stood there with the same calm smile from that morning. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. I blinked twice. No. He sat beside me as though it were the most natural decision in the world. Around us, the whispers became noticeably louder before fading into stunned silence. Even the professor glanced toward our row for a brief second before beginning the lecture. I spent the next 50 minutes understanding absolutely nothing about economics. Every time I tried focusing on supply curves or market equilibrium, I became painfully aware that the most admired student on campus was quietly taking notes beside me. His handwriting was neat. His notebook was perfectly organized. At one point, he noticed me searching through my backpack. Without saying a word, he gently placed an extra pen on my desk. "You forgot yours," he whispered. "Thank you." I answered automatically before realizing I had actually packed 3 pens that morning. He simply assumed I needed one because I looked distracted. Somehow that tiny gesture made me even more uncomfortable. After class ended, students flooded into the hallway. I hoped to escape before Mason caught up with me, but he easily matched my pace. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. "There is a coffee shop across the street." Every reasonable thought in my head screamed that this was the perfect opportunity to explain everything. Tell him the letter belonged to Lara. Tell him the misunderstanding had spread too far already. Tell him before another rumor appeared. Instead, I looked into his eyes and found something unexpected. He was nervous. It was barely noticeable, just a slight hesitation before every sentence. A tiny breath that suggested he was choosing each word carefully. This was not the confident golden boy everyone admired from a distance. This was simply another college student hoping a conversation would not go badly. "Sure," I heard myself say. The coffee shop was busy with afternoon students escaping the chilly breeze outside. We found a small table near the window. Mason thanked the barista by name before carrying both drinks over, even though I insisted I could pay for my own. "You can get the next one," he said with an easy smile. "Next one." The words echoed strangely in my head, as if he already expected there would be another conversation after today. We talked about ordinary things at first. Classes, favorite professors, the bookstore that never seemed to stock enough used textbooks. I learned he actually hated public speaking despite always appearing confident. He learned I worked part-time at a neighborhood bookstore every weekend because I loved recommending novels to strangers. Every few minutes I prepared myself to confess the truth about the letter, but somehow the conversation kept drifting elsewhere. It felt peaceful in a way I had not expected. There were no dramatic declarations, no impossible romance, just 2 students sharing warm coffee while autumn leaves drifted past the windows. Then Mason looked down at the folded blue envelope resting carefully inside his backpack. His fingers brushed the edge with surprising gentleness before he looked back at me. "I have read it 3 times already," he admitted quietly. "Nobody has ever noticed the parts of me that you somehow saw immediately." My heart sank. He believed every single word inside that letter. Every sentence Lara had written about him had already become something he thought came from me. I opened my mouth to finally tell him the truth. At that exact moment, my phone lit up with another message from Lara. "Did he read it? Please tell me everything." I locked the screen before Mason could accidentally see it. For reasons I still could not explain, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and said nothing at all. The next morning, I promised myself that I would tell Mason the truth before another misunderstanding had the chance to grow any larger. It sounded simple while I was brushing my teeth, packing my backpack, and walking across campus beneath trees whose leaves had already begun turning brilliant shades of orange and red. It still sounded simple while I crossed the main quad and watched students hurry toward early classes with coffee balanced in one hand and textbooks tucked beneath the other. Then I actually saw Mason waiting outside the business building. He was standing exactly where the morning sunlight reached the front steps, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jacket and the other holding 2 paper cups. The moment he noticed me, his expression softened into the same quiet smile that somehow felt different from the one he gave everyone else. "Good morning," he said. "I guessed you would skip breakfast again." Before I could answer, he held out one of the cups. It was hot chocolate instead of coffee. The cashier said people who always smile usually prefer something sweeter, he explained with an embarrassed laugh. I hope they were right. I accepted the cup without thinking. They actually were. His shoulders relaxed, almost as though my answer mattered far more than it should have. We walked toward class together, talking about an upcoming history exam instead of the letter folded safely inside his backpack. Several students looked our way. Some smiled knowingly. Others nudged their friends before whispering behind raised hands. I felt the familiar wave of embarrassment rise again, but Mason seemed completely unaware of it. Or perhaps he simply chose not to care. During our communications class, Professor Adler announced the semester's biggest assignment. Every student would complete a 6-week research project with a randomly assigned partner. Groans filled the room while names appeared one pair at a time across the projector screen. I barely paid attention until I saw my own name. Ethan Brooks. Mason Carter. The classroom erupted into playful cheers before I could even process what had happened. Someone near the back jokingly shouted, "That pairing was definitely not random." Even Professor Adler smiled before reminding everyone to settle down. I buried my face in my notebook, while Mason quietly pulled his chair beside mine. "Looks like we are teammates," he said. "I guess we are," I answered weakly. After class, we agreed to meet in the library that afternoon to begin outlining our presentation. I arrived 15 minutes early, hoping the quiet would help me organize my thoughts. Instead, I found Mason already sitting near the large windows with books spread neatly across the table. He had reserved my favorite seat without even knowing it was my favorite. "I noticed you always look outside while thinking," he said after seeing my surprised expression. "So I figured this spot might help." It was such a small observation that it caught me completely off guard. Most people barely noticed I was in the room. Somehow he had noticed where my eyes naturally wandered. We spent nearly 2 hours researching together. He was patient whenever I interrupted myself halfway through an idea. He listened carefully instead of waiting for his turn to speak. When I became excited about one historical article, he smiled and encouraged me to explain why I liked it. He never acted like the smartest person at the table, even though everyone knew he probably was. Somewhere between discussing old newspaper archives and comparing presentation topics, the silence between us became comfortable instead of awkward. Around 5 o'clock, my stomach growled loudly enough for both of us to hear. I laughed in embarrassment. Mason quietly reached into his backpack and placed a wrapped granola bar beside my notebook. "I started carrying an extra one yesterday," he admitted. "Just in case you forgot lunch again." I stared at the snack for several seconds. Nobody had ever paid enough attention to notice little habits like that before. "You really did not have to do that," I said softly. "I wanted to." His answer was immediate and completely sincere. Those 3 words settled somewhere unexpectedly deep inside my chest. They should not have mattered. They certainly should not have made telling the truth feel even harder. As we packed our books, Lara suddenly appeared at the end of the library aisle. The moment she noticed Mason standing beside me, she froze. Her eyes widened before she quickly looked away, clearly too nervous to approach. She gave me a tiny wave that only I seemed to notice before disappearing behind another bookshelf. Mason followed my gaze. "Do you know her?" he asked. My heartbeat stumbled. This was it. One honest sentence could untangle everything. I looked toward the aisle where Lara had vanished, then back at Mason, who was waiting patiently with the same open expression that trusted whatever answer I would give. The truth stood only a few words away, yet somehow those words refused to leave my mouth. "Yes," I finally whispered. "She is just someone who asked me for a favor a few days ago." It was not a lie, but for the first time in my life, it was not the whole truth either. Over the next 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. The rumors around campus never completely disappeared, but they slowly became background noise instead of the center of my attention. What changed instead was my routine. Without ever discussing it, Mason somehow became part of almost every ordinary moment in my day. We met before our morning classes to review notes for our project. We worked together in the library every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Sometimes we grabbed sandwiches from the student center before heading back to our research. None of it felt dramatic. It simply happened one quiet day after another until it began to feel normal. I kept waiting for the version of Mason everyone talked about to appear. The confident campus celebrity. The flawless golden boy who could effortlessly charm an entire room. Instead, I discovered someone very different whenever nobody else was watching. He always held the library door open for students. Carrying heavy backpacks, He quietly returned abandoned shopping carts outside the campus market. He remembered the names of the elderly couple who ran the small coffee stand near the science building. One afternoon, I watched him stop in the middle of the sidewalk because a little girl visiting campus with her mother had dropped a stuffed rabbit. He picked it up, brushed a few leaves from its ears, and handed it back with the same gentle smile he gave everyone else. He never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. Somehow that simple moment stayed with me much longer than any basketball highlight I had ever heard people describe. I started noticing other small things too. Every Wednesday, he skipped lunch. At first I assumed he was too busy, but one afternoon I accidentally saw him carrying an extra meal into the tutoring center. He left it on the front desk with a handwritten note that simply read, "For whoever forgot today." No name, no credit. When I asked the receptionist about it later, she smiled. He does that almost every week. I found myself thinking about that little note during my shift at the neighborhood bookstore that Saturday. Around 3 o'clock the front bell chimed, and I looked up expecting another customer searching for a mystery novel. Instead, Mason stepped inside wearing a dark green sweater instead of his usual campus hoodie. For a second, he looked almost uncertain. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. "You mentioned this place the other day, and I realized I have never actually visited." I laughed. "You came all the way here just to look at books?" "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I wanted someone to recommend one." The store was quiet that afternoon, with soft jazz playing through old speakers and sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. I walked him through my favorite shelves, pulling out novels that had stayed with me long after I finished reading them. He listened carefully, as if every recommendation mattered. Eventually, he chose one simply because I said, "This story made me feel less alone during my first semester." He did not even read the back cover first. He trusted my opinion that easily. Before leaving, he bought 2 bookmarks. One stayed inside his new book. The other he placed on the counter in front of me. "You always lose your place," he said with a grin. I stared at him in surprise. "How did you know that?" "Every time we study, you spend at least 30 seconds looking for where you stopped reading." I could not remember ever mentioning it. He had simply noticed. Later that evening, as we walked toward the parking lot beneath strings of golden leaves dancing in the cool breeze, neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence was comfortable now, no longer filled with awkwardness or uncertainty. Then Mason quietly broke it. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. He looked toward the fading sunset instead of at me. "Back when I first read that letter, were you nervous because you thought I would reject you?" My footsteps slowed. The question was gentle. There was no accusation in his voice, only genuine curiosity. I felt the familiar weight settle inside my chest once again. The truth was still there, waiting to be spoken. But now it no longer threatened only a misunderstanding. It threatened every quiet morning, every shared cup of hot chocolate, every conversation in the library, every tiny kindness that had slowly become part of both our lives. I looked at the bookmark still resting safely inside my jacket pocket, took a slow breath, and realized that somewhere between one mistaken letter and 100 ordinary moments, explaining everything had become far more frightening than staying silent. After that evening, I began noticing something that I should have seen much sooner. Everyone on campus seemed to know Mason, but very few people actually knew him. They admired him from a distance. They congratulated him after games, asked him for advice before exams, and smiled whenever he walked by. Yet almost every conversation ended after a few polite minutes. Then everyone drifted back to their own lives while he quietly continued walking alone. Once I realized it, I could not stop seeing it. Every Monday morning, he sat beneath the same maple tree outside the student center 10 minutes before class. Every Thursday, he studied in the same corner of the library. Every Friday afternoon, he bought dinner from the same food truck before heading toward the athletic center. His schedule looked full, but somehow there was always an invisible space around him that nobody crossed. Without making a conscious decision, I started filling some of those quiet moments. If I passed the campus bakery before our study session, I picked up an extra blueberry muffin because I had noticed he always chose blueberry whenever there was one left. When I borrowed history books from the library, I automatically checked whether the research section had the economics journals he had been searching for. During one rainy afternoon, I arrived at the library carrying an umbrella that was just large enough for one person. Mason was standing outside beneath the entrance overhang, watching the steady rain fall across the brick courtyard. "Did you forget yours?" I asked. He gave a small nod before smiling almost apologetically. The weather forecast said there was only a 10% chance. I laughed. Then I guess we found the 10%. Without thinking very much about it, I stepped closer and tilted the umbrella until it covered both of us. We walked across the courtyard shoulder to shoulder, carefully avoiding puddles while the rain tapped softly above us. Neither of us hurried. Neither of us spoke very much. The silence felt warm instead of empty. Halfway across the courtyard, he quietly said, "Thank you." "For sharing the umbrella?" I asked. He shook his head. "For making ordinary days feel less ordinary." His words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. They should not have mattered as much as they did, but they settled somewhere deep inside my heart. A few days later, I returned from my weekend shift at the bookstore feeling exhausted after helping customers prepare for midterm season. When I reached my apartment building, I found a small paper bag sitting outside my door. There was no note. Inside was a bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup packed carefully inside a reusable container, along with 2 fresh dinner rolls from the bakery near campus. I immediately knew who had left it. The next morning, I found Mason waiting outside our classroom as usual. "Did you forget your container?" I asked with a smile. He looked genuinely confused for a second before realizing what I meant. "You looked tired yesterday," he admitted. "You said your bookstore gets busy before exams. So you made soup?" His ears turned slightly pink. "Actually, my grandmother taught me the recipe when I was little." I could not help smiling. It was really good. Relief crossed his face so quickly that I almost missed it. It was such a tiny thing. Just soup. Just an umbrella. Just an extra muffin. None of those moments would ever appear in a romantic movie or become famous stories people told years later. Yet somehow they carried more meaning than grand gestures ever could. Little by little, we had begun learning each other's routines without trying. I remembered how he preferred hot chocolate over coffee after sunset. He remembered that I always became quiet whenever I was worried about an exam. I knew he rubbed the back of his neck whenever he was stressed. He knew I absent-mindedly tapped my pencil against the table whenever I was thinking too hard. We never talked about these observations. We simply noticed them because we paid attention. Then one Tuesday evening, after another long study session, we walked toward the parking lot beneath a sky already glowing with early winter stars. Mason suddenly stopped beside the empty basketball court. The lights above the bleachers had already been turned off, leaving only the soft glow from nearby campus buildings. He looked across the silent court before speaking so quietly that I almost missed it. "People think it must be wonderful when everyone knows your name," he said. "But sometimes I wonder whether anyone actually sees me." I looked at him without saying a word. For the first time since we met, the smile that everyone admired was completely gone. Standing beside me was not the golden boy everyone believed they knew. Standing beside me was simply Mason, looking more alone than I had ever imagined. That night, Mason's quiet confession stayed with me long after I returned to my apartment. I had always assumed loneliness belonged to people who sat alone in cafeterias or struggled to make friends during freshman year. I never imagined it could hide behind easy smiles, perfect grades, and endless applause. The next morning, I found myself arriving on campus earlier than usual. The air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and a thin layer of frost covered the edges of the grass outside the student center. Mason was already there, sitting beneath the same maple tree with a textbook open on his lap. He looked up as I approached, and for just a second, genuine surprise crossed his face before his familiar smile returned. "You are early," he said. I held out a paper bag from the bakery. I figured somebody might skip breakfast if nobody reminded him. He laughed softly, the sound quieter than usual, but more real than any cheerful greeting I had heard from him before. "I guess somebody knows me pretty well now." We ate in comfortable silence while the campus slowly came to life around us. Students hurried toward class with steaming coffee cups, bicycles rolled across the sidewalks, and professors crossed the courtyard carrying stacks of papers. It was the kind of ordinary morning that most people would forget by lunchtime, yet I found myself wishing it could last a little longer. Over the following week, our project continued to bring us together almost every day. We finished most of the research ahead of schedule, but somehow we always found another excuse to stay another hour. Sometimes we discussed books. Sometimes we debated whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Sometimes we simply watched snow clouds gather beyond the library windows without feeling the need to fill every silence. I realized something unexpected during those quiet afternoons. Mason rarely talked about himself unless someone asked directly. Even then, his answers were usually short, carefully chosen, almost as though he had spent years learning how to reveal just enough without revealing anything important. One evening, while organizing presentation slides in an empty classroom, his phone vibrated across the desk. He glanced at the screen, and the relaxed expression on his face disappeared almost instantly. He answered after the third ring. "Hi, Dad." His voice became noticeably more formal. I pretended to focus on my laptop, but the room was too quiet not to overhear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, the presentation is going well. No, I have not forgotten about graduate school applications. I understand. Yes, I will keep my grades up." There was a long pause. Then he quietly answered, "I know being second is not enough." When the call ended, he remained perfectly still for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the desk. I looked over carefully. "Everything okay?" He smiled automatically. It was the practice smile everyone else on campus believed without question. "Everything is fine." I tilted my head. "You do not have to say that if it is not true." His smile faded. He looked toward the classroom windows where the last light of the afternoon was slowly disappearing beyond the campus buildings. "My parents are good people," he said after a long silence. "They have always wanted the best for me." He paused before quietly adding, "Sometimes I just wish they believed I was enough before I accomplished something." I did not answer right away. Instead, I reached into my backpack and pulled out the worn paperback novel he had bought weeks earlier at the bookstore. A small sticky note still marked one of my favorite pages. I opened the book and handed it to him. He read the highlighted sentence silently before looking back at me. The line simply said, "The people who truly care about you never ask you to earn your place in their lives." Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Mason closed the book with careful hands. "Nobody has ever given me something like that before," he admitted. "It is only a sentence," I said. He shook his head. "No. It is someone paying attention." As we packed our bags to leave, snowflakes began drifting gently past the classroom windows, covering the campus in the first snowfall of the season. We stepped outside together, watching students laugh as they stretched out their hands to catch the falling snow. Mason stood quietly beside me before asking a question that made my heart stumble. "Can I tell you something strange?" I nodded. He looked at the snow instead of at me. "Before all of this happened, people noticed what I achieved. Since meeting you, I think I finally understand what it feels like when someone notices who I am instead." I felt warmth spread through my chest, even as guilt quietly tightened around it. Every kind word between us had been built on a misunderstanding that I still had not found the courage to correct, and for the first time, I realized I was no longer afraid of losing a rumor. I was afraid of losing the person standing beside me. The first snow of the semester remained on the ground for nearly a week, covering the campus with a quiet stillness that made everything feel softer than before. Finals were approaching, students hurried between buildings carrying stacks of review guides, and every table inside the library filled before noon. Mason and I spent nearly every afternoon finishing our research presentation, but by then the project had become an excuse rather than a reason to see each other. We had already completed more work than Professor Adler expected. Still, neither of us seemed eager to stop meeting. One Thursday evening, we submitted the final draft together. The confirmation email appeared on both of our laptops at exactly the same time. "That is it," I said with a smile. "We are officially finished." Mason looked at the screen for a moment before quietly closing his computer. "I guess we are." There was something strangely disappointed in the way he said it, as though finishing the assignment meant reaching the end of something much bigger. I felt the same uneasy feeling but could not bring myself to admit it. We left the library together and walked toward the student center while light snow drifted through the glow of the campus lights. Neither of us rushed to say goodbye. We wandered slowly, talking about winter break, favorite holiday movies, and the tiny bookstore where I worked. It felt peaceful until I heard someone call my name. "Ethan." I turned around and saw Lara jogging toward us, her scarf bouncing behind her in the cold evening air. She stopped a few feet away, breathing quickly before looking from me to Mason. The nervous expression on her face told me she had rehearsed this conversation many times. "I need to tell both of you something," she said quietly. My heartbeat immediately began to race. Lara, I whispered, hoping she would stop before it was too late. She shook her head. No, I should have said this weeks ago. Mason looked between us with calm curiosity, completely unaware that the foundation beneath his world was about to shift. Lara took a slow breath. The letter. Her voice trembled slightly. I wrote it. Silence settled over the snowy walkway. Even the distant sounds of students laughing outside the residence halls seemed to disappear. Mason did not speak. He simply looked at Lara for several long seconds before turning toward me. There was no anger on his face. Only confusion. Quiet, unmistakable confusion. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Lara continued before I could find any. Ethan was only helping me. He never meant for you to think. She lowered her eyes. Everything happened so fast. Then the rumors spread everywhere. I kept waiting for the right moment to explain, but every day it became harder. Mason still said nothing. He looked at the folded blue envelope that he had carefully carried inside his backpack for weeks before slowly taking it out. The edges had become slightly worn from being opened so many times. He stared at it for a moment before asking me one gentle question. You knew? I could not lie anymore. Yes, I answered quietly. From the very beginning. He nodded once. The movement was almost too small to notice. Why did you never tell me? That question hurt far more than if he had raised his voice. I searched for an answer that could somehow explain everything I had felt over the past weeks. At first I wanted to, I admitted. Then every day we spent together made it harder because I was afraid. My voice faded. Afraid of what? He asked softly. I looked down at the snow gathering around my shoes. Afraid that once you knew the truth, I would lose you. Another long silence passed between us. Finally, Mason gave a faint smile that carried none of the warmth I had come to treasure. Ethan, he said gently, I was never hurt because the letter was not yours. His eyes met mine, filled with a sadness I had never seen before. I am hurt because you believed I needed a misunderstanding to stay. Those words settled heavily between us. He carefully folded the letter one last time before placing it back inside his backpack. Then he looked at Lara with kindness that somehow made everything even more painful. Thank you for being honest, he said. Turning back to me, he took a slow breath. I think I need some time. Without another word, he walked away across the snow-covered campus. I stood frozen beneath the falling snow, watching the distance between us grow one quiet step at a time, finally understanding that the truth I had been so afraid to speak had not destroyed a rumor. It had broken the trust of the one person whose quiet presence had slowly become the safest place I had ever known. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as though the entire campus had lost its usual rhythm. Winter break was only a week away, and students were busy finishing final exams, packing suitcases, and making plans to go home. Life around me continued exactly as it always had, yet one familiar part of every day had disappeared. The seat beneath the maple tree was empty each morning. The extra chair beside mine in the library remained untouched. My phone stayed silent. I finally understood how much space one person could leave behind without saying a single word. I wanted to respect Mason's request for time, but every ordinary place reminded me of him. I still reached for 2 hot chocolates before remembering I only needed 1. I still caught myself looking toward the basketball court after class, expecting to see him practicing long after everyone else had left. Each small habit became another quiet reminder of everything I had almost thrown away because I had been too afraid to tell the truth. 3 days before winter break, I returned to the bookstore for my evening shift. Business was slow because most students had already finished shopping for gifts. While organizing a shelf of classic novels, I found the same brand of pale blue stationery Lara had used for her letter. I stood there holding the box for several seconds before placing it into my shopping basket. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, staring at a blank sheet of paper. I realized something important. The first letter had never belonged to me. Every beautiful sentence Mason had treasured had been written by someone else. If I wanted even the smallest chance to earn back his trust, I could not borrow another person's words. I had to write my own. I crossed out more sentences than I kept. I did not promise forever because I had not earned the right to make promises. I did not ask him to forgive me because forgiveness was his decision alone. Instead, I simply told the truth I should have spoken from the beginning. I wrote that somewhere between shared umbrellas, library afternoons, bowls of homemade soup, quiet walks across campus, and ordinary conversations about books and breakfast, my feelings had stopped being part of a misunderstanding. They had become completely real. I admitted that fear had made me selfish. I had been so terrified of losing his friendship that I ended up hurting the very person I wanted to protect. When I finished, the final page contained no dramatic poetry and no perfect declarations. It ended with one simple sentence. This letter is finally mine. The following afternoon, I walked to the campus athletic center, knowing Mason usually finished his final practice just before sunset. Snow covered the sidewalks, and cold wind swept across the nearly empty campus. He stepped outside carrying his gym bag, looking surprised to find me waiting near the entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I held out the folded envelope with both hands. "I am not asking you to read it now," I said quietly. "Or even today. I only wanted to give you something that actually belongs to me." Mason accepted the envelope without opening it. His eyes searched my face, as though trying to understand something beyond my words. "There is nothing borrowed inside," I continued. "No misunderstanding. No one else's feelings. Just mine." He looked down at the envelope for a long moment before carefully unfolding it. The winter wind stirred softly around us as his eyes moved. Slowly across the page, I watched every small change in his expression without daring to interrupt. When he reached the final sentence, he closed his eyes briefly and smiled with quiet warmth that I had missed more than I could ever explain. He looked back at me, holding the letter gently against his chest. "The first letter was never yours," he said softly. My heart sank for a single second before he took one small step closer. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, his smile growing brighter than the falling snow around us, "I started wishing it had been." Winter break passed more quickly than either of us expected. We spent the holidays in different towns with our families, yet every morning began with a simple message. "Good morning. Have a good day. Do not forget breakfast." The conversations were never long, but they carried a quiet comfort that made the miles between us feel much shorter. When the spring semester finally began, the campus looked completely different. The snow had melted, patches of green had returned across the lawns, and students once again filled every sidewalk with laughter and hurried conversations. As I walked through the front gate on the first Monday back, I spotted someone waiting beneath the maple tree where so many ordinary mornings had quietly changed both of our lives. Mason looked up the moment he saw me. This time neither of us hesitated. He handed me a warm cup of hot chocolate before I could even say hello. "I remembered," he said with a smile. I laughed. "You always do." From that day forward, we stopped pretending that we were only finding excuses to spend time together. We still studied in the library, argued over which pizza place near campus deserved the highest rating, and wandered through the bookstore where he never left without asking me to recommend one more novel. The biggest difference was that neither of us carried unspoken fears anymore. Whenever something felt uncertain, we talked about it. Whenever one of us worried too much, the other listened instead of guessing. Trust, I learned, was built in conversations that happened before misunderstandings had the chance to grow. As spring turned into summer, our lives continued moving forward in ways that felt wonderfully ordinary. Mason still volunteered every other weekend, but now I often joined him, helping children choose books from the reading corner while he organized games nearby. I continued working at the bookstore, and every Friday evening he appeared just before closing time, claiming he happened to be passing by even though we both knew it was a 20-minute drive from his apartment. We celebrated small victories instead of waiting for extraordinary ones. A difficult exam completed, a presentation that went well, a favorite professor remembering our names, a sunset that painted the campus in shades of gold after a long day. Those moments became the memories we treasured most. One afternoon near the end of sophomore year, we found ourselves walking across the same courtyard where everything had first begun. Students hurried past carrying backpacks, someone laughed near the fountain, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Mason stopped beside the familiar stone path and reached into his backpack. For a second I thought he had forgotten another assignment. Instead, he carefully unfolded 2 letters. One was the old blue envelope with softened edges from being carried for so many months. The other was my handwritten letter, now just as worn from being read again and again. He smiled before placing the first letter into my hands. "I think this one can finally rest," he said. Then he held on to the second. But this one is staying with me. I looked at him, unable to hide my smile. You still read it? He nodded without embarrassment. Whenever I need to remember that the best things in my life usually begin with honesty instead of perfection. We continued walking side by side, leaving the old misunderstanding exactly where it belonged, somewhere behind us. Around campus, some people still recognized Mason as the golden boy. Others simply waved at the quiet couple who always seemed to carry an extra drink, an extra snack, or an extra umbrella for each other. Titles no longer mattered. Rumors had long since disappeared. What remained was something far stronger than the story that first brought us together. It was built from shared mornings, patient conversations, thoughtful gestures, and the choice to keep showing up for each other, one ordinary day at a time. Sometimes I still think about the moment when one misplaced letter changed everything. If I had taken a different path across campus that morning, our lives might never have crossed in quite the same way. Yet looking at Mason beside me, smiling as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the walkway ahead, I realized that our future was never defined by a misunderstanding. It was defined by what we chose after the truth finally found its way into the open, and together we stepped forward toward every ordinary tomorrow that was still waiting to be written.